This is Kick-Ass News. I'm Ben Mathis. You heard that right, folks. Now Kick-Ass Politics is Kick-Ass News. I'll still be covering a lot of politics, but the word politics sometimes turns off potential guests. And as you've noticed, I want to be able to reach out to a broader array of guests without them having to worry about me trying to trap them into a political debate. So don't worry, it's still the same show, just a slightly different name. There's even a new website at kickassnewspodcast.com. Also, this is kind of a big deal. This is the 100th episode of Kick-Ass Politics. Kick-Ass News. And I always said that I would do at least 100 episodes and see how I felt about it after that. Well, I'm happy to say I'm having a blast. And I want to thank all of you for listening and subscribing. And I especially want to thank those of you who've donated and written in to encourage me along the way. It means a lot to me. And if you want to mark this occasion, then support the show by donating $100 to celebrate 100 episodes. You can do that at gofundme.com/kickassnews, or you can set up a recurring donation to sustain the show at patreon.com/kickassnews. Thanks for listening and helping me get to 100. And now, enjoy the 100th episode of Kick-Ass News with special guest Dick Cavett. Hi, I'm Ben Mathis, and welcome to Kick-Ass News. For my 100th episode, I have the great pleasure of welcoming a man whose career in television has spanned 5 decades, earning him 3 Emmy Awards and 10 nominations. He's arguably the greatest showbiz raconteur of our time, whose name is most commonly preceded by the words witty and erudite. I'm of course talking about the legendary Dick Cavett. Dick Cavett began as a stand-up comedian and a monologue writer on The Tonight Show, first banging out jokes for Jack Paar and then a few years later for Johnny Carson. In 1968, Dick Cavett stepped in front of the cameras for the first time as the host of his own late-night talk show. He quickly gained a reputation as the thinking man's talk show host. Unlike most talk shows, the guest roster on The Dick Cavett Show went well beyond just movie stars plugging their latest projects. He invited authors, directors, political leaders, intellectuals, columnists, and critics on the show as well. It became a salon of sorts where the wittiest, most interesting people of the day gathered to tell stories, trade barbs, and participate in spirited conversations that sometimes got a little raucous. Some of the guests who made multiple appearances included Orson Welles, John Lennon, Truman Capote, Katharine Hepburn, Salvador Dali, Woody Allen, Muhammad Ali, Alfred Hitchcock, Mick Jagger, Ronald Reagan, Laurence Olivier, Tennessee Williams, Janis Joplin, Marlon Brando, Howard Cosell, Bette Davis, Ray Charles, Gerald Ford, Henry Fonda, Hugh Hefner, Fred Astaire, Gore Vidal, Tennessee Williams, David Niven, Barry Goldwater, Ralph Nader, Zero Mostel, John Huston, Jackie Gleason, and of course his favorite recurring guest, Groucho Marx. And those were a few guests from just the first 7 years when his show aired on ABC. The Dick Cavett Show, in its various incarnations, would air almost continuously for 28 years on 5 different TV networks. He also made numerous guest appearances on TV and film, often playing himself. More recently, Dick Cavett hosted a TV special for PBS called Dick Cavett's Watergate, followed the next year by Dick Cavett's Vietnam, and in 2012 he co-starred in the HBO special Mel Brooks and Dick Cavett Together Again, for which he won an Emmy nomination. He's written 4 books, including his most recent one called Brief Encounters: Conversations, Magic Moments, and Assorted Hijinks. On today's podcast, Dick Cavett will hijack the show Walter Winchell style, and then we'll talk about his lucky break sneaking on the set of The Tonight Show with Jack Paar. He'll talk at length about his friendship with his idol Groucho Marx, his friendly rivalry with Johnny Carson, how he ended up on Nixon's enemies list, and the time a guest actually died on air. He'll reminisce about some of his favorite guests and friends, including Jack Benny, Ed Sullivan, and Truman Capote. Plus, he'll tell the story of the night a woman tried to seduce he and Marlon Brando into a threesome. Coming up with the legendary Dick Cavett in just a moment.
This is Richard A. Cavett talking to you from New York City and all the ships at sea. Let's go to press.
All right.
This is Walter Winchell. Oh, sorry,
yeah, it's funny. Nobody remembers the old Walter Winchell intro to all
how old are
Mr. and Mrs. America.
We know none of our ignorant youth know it, but
yeah,
or maybe our ignorant Trump. But how far back? I guess you have to be at least 50, 60. More.
Yeah, 50s, I guess. Yeah.
Greeting, Mr. President, North America, and all the ships at sea, let's go to press. I spent an evening with Walter Winchell at the Copacabana, and then later in his car, he took me to go to the, he'd been on my show, and he took me to go to the Copa. He showed up in a tuxedo and a .38 in his waistband.
What was he afraid of?
Not being recognized anymore, partly. This was way past his career. But then he put on his, I think, illegal police phone radio and heard something at one of the precincts. We drove down there, and he used to live when his radio, whatever he heard, he would drive to the scene and get things for his column. But in this case, there was no column anymore. But thank God, from his sake, down at the jailhouse or whatever we went to, some kid said, "Hey, Pop, wait a minute, talk some more." He had recognized the voice from The Untouchables. Oh. Wasn't it, where Winchell was the voice?
Yeah, I think so. It's a kind of a sad ending to him. I think the McCarthy thing did him in when he chose the wrong side in that battle.
Yeah. But, you know, I remember being in the basement in Lincoln, Nebraska. My father and I were picking walnuts open that we had gathered. And Winchell, in the middle of his show, said, "And we have a president who doesn't know what the HELL is going on. This is Walter Winchell." And he got landslided by that. The president was FDR.
Yeah.
For young folks, that stands for Franklin Delano.
Yeah. Okay. And it's interesting because he created his own vernacular.
Yes, he had his own vocabulary. He had his own dance steps. He danced on the show. Very good. He was a vaudevillian.
Oh, was he? Oh, I didn't know that about him. I thought he's... Oh, you know what? A lot of times I get him mixed up with Damon Runyon. I was going to say I thought he started out as a sports writer, but that's Damon Runyon.
Well, that's because he always mentioned the Damon Runyon Cancer Fund.
Yeah, they ran in the same circles.
Right.
Well, I didn't give you an intro yet, but I guess I should.
Oh, you can do it later if you want.
My guest today is the legendary TV host Dick Cavett. For 35 years, he hosted The Dick Cavett Show, which was known as the thinking man's talk show because you not only had movie stars, you had authors, critics, intellectuals, musicians, just about anyone that piqued your interest,
and there were 4 or 5 manifestations of the Dick Cavett show as time went by.
Yeah, you may have been on more networks than anyone in TV history, I think.
I don't think, if there were that many networks today, think how many I'd have to be on.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, you know what I meant by that, even though grammatically it was not a perfect sentence. Well, logically, I should say. Well, I go back to the, in some ways, better time when you had 3 choices, and that's all of channel for TV.
Yeah, and you had shared experiences then. We're all so fragmented today. Nobody has that shared experience of you go to the office the next day and you say, "Oh, did you see Brando on Cavett last night?"
Right.
And everyone knew what you were talking about.
Just about everybody. Yeah. This is curious and probably not very interesting to most people. But I had more viewers, and so did other people in those days who were on one of the networks, that, in effect, anybody does now, because there were only those three, and many more people filled up those three than are dispersed now among everything else.
Oh, yeah. I mean, these days, 2 or 3 million households, that's a hit.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think, what was considered good ratings back then?
I'm not sure. That's an interesting question, but how many did Milton Berle have at his peak when he became Mr. Television? And when the coaxial cable got to Nebraska, so we got to see Uncle Milty, about whom Fred Allen said, Milton is the moron's messiah. Great.
Famous joke stealer. Well, one of the things that I like about you that I've always kind of enjoyed, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is I feel like we had a similar childhood in some respects, in that I was a kid who grew up loving magic. I was obsessed with magic. Okay. And you talk about how you would sneak into the back of theaters with a copy of Variety under your arm so you could meet a celebrity. I used to do that. I would have the local newspaper would give me a letter from the editor so I could go interview Ginger Rogers or something when they came to Houston, Texas.
That sounds like, do you think we might be related in some way?
Possibly. These days, what is that thing where you send in your DNA?
My wife, who did one of those, said, I never knew I was Scottish in any sense. Found an ancestor from Edinburgh or somewhere.
Really?
Edinburgh is in Scotland, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest fear for me would be to find out you're related to your wife or something like that.
Well, Groucho's god, George S. Kaufman, said once, advice to his daughter, sample everything in life except incest and folk dancing.
Now, that was one of your heroes, Groucho, and one of my favorite people. I wish that I had been able to get to know him like you did.
I still don't believe I knew him, that he would call me up to go somewhere, and he came to town, that I was in his house. I had to pinch myself the whole time. Did I ever tell you, sneaking out of a dinner Groucho was bored with, let's get out of here, and a snooty hostess came up and said, well, leaving so soon, Mr. Marx? Groucho said, I've had a wonderful evening, but this wasn't it.
Now, you knew him later on in life. Was he still pretty sharp?
He was very sharp when I met him.
I mean, I've seen him on the show, and sometimes he would kind of meander and ramble, and then
because
the light would come on.
I did so many shows with him over several years, and you can see some failing in the later ones.
Yeah.
In the one great one with the golf hat with the funny stuff ball on it, that when he proposed marriage on a later show of mine to Truman Capote, Capote, you remember the hat? It was a golf hat, but it had little figures,
the fuzzy ball on top,
and
right?
it had knitted golf on.
Yeah.
And Truman came back with, Groucho, I could never marry a man who has 3 balls on his hat. On his hat was never heard by the audience. The laugh came.
Well, what was
Sorry,
he like? I mean, I've seen all the episodes, but you actually got to hang out with him. You befriended him and were good friends for quite a while. Was he the same in real life? Was he the guy who was always kind of on and being Groucho, or did he talk about life?
He was always Groucho, and what inadvertent thing might have happened in public, he would always deal with it as Groucho Marx. Later life, he complained that he couldn't. He said one day, I can't insult anybody anymore.
Why not?
Well, here's what I mean.
Because they enjoy it too much?
I have an incident. I hope this happened to me. I've mixed some of them up. Beverly Hills, dining room, hotel. Some jerk comes up and says, hey, Groucho, this is my wife. Say something insulting to my wife. Groucho winced, looked, and said, with a wife like that, you should be able to think of your own insults.
That's pretty damn good.
They laugh.
Off the cuff like that.
You think if you didn't know who said it, it would be offensive.
Yeah.
And then he said, see, they're happy. They run off and say, wait till you hear what Groucho said to me.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of the Jack Benny story that you tell. Do you remember that one?
Which one?
Well, I'm not sure. There might be many, but you talk about how I think you were still at NBC, you're in the elevator with him, and
Oh,
a bunch of people
I know
would
the one.
hit him up with all the annoying questions, which probably happens
Are
to you a lot too.
Do you still play the violin? Do you still have the Maxwell?
Yeah,
Do you have a
tourists.
guy under your house in a vault guarding your money? Are you really cheap? I mean, in 7 floors, they got 10 of them in. He winced, but he's such a nice man. The only man, maybe, in show business in its history that hadn't a single enemy. Generous, wonderful, as they say in vaudeville, worked clean and yet still was
Right.
hilarious. Funny, they all rushed out to talk to their friends. The elevator got to the bottom, and I said, Mr. Benny, do you ever get kind of tired of those same old things year after year?
Same old
And he
questions.
smiled, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, you know, kid, sometimes you just want to tell them to go fuck themselves. I promise you, if you want to close in a public appearance with that story, you'll get off on a big laugh.
Yeah, no, I believe it. Well, we opened with it then. Did he put his hand on his cheek as he said it?
Well, yeah, maybe not at that moment, but yeah, that sort of soft, weak hand at the right side of his cheek, and then dropping it to the other hand, one foot a little out to the side. If you watch his monologue on his old show, he's always got one foot out, sort of like a classical actor.
And all these guys hung out. There was Burns, there was Jack Benny, and Groucho used to always hang out at the Hillcrest Country Club, didn't they? And play
I got
cards?
taken there by one of my dream experiences by Groucho for lunch. We approached a table in the dining room. It was lunch that had almost all actors. I mean, it would have Cary Grant and Edward G. Robinson and whoever else. Wow. And we were headed for that when Groucho heard the voice of George Jessel saying, and tell him I'm fucking him. I'm not coming to the phone for anyone. And Groucho said, let's go to the writer's table, which he preferred to show business anyway. He'd rather be remembered as a writer than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Didn't you meet him at the funeral of George S. Kaufman?
I did. I went to the funeral because the night before I had seen Woody Allen for the first time in the club. The Parr Show had sent me to scout this kid who had written for Sid Caesar at age 15. I hate this guy already. Woody was having a terrible time in those days with the audience.
Really?
The Rollins office was making him perform. And we lamented the fact that George Kaufman had died that day. We decided to go to the funeral, but then Woody couldn't, and I did. Saw Moss Hart read the eulogy. He took it out of his pocket. He typed it. And before he read it, he said, I can hear George in the casket saying it needs cutting. And then I looked across the ante-room. They'd had to open other rooms to get everybody. It's total sellout, so to speak, ceremony with everyone I had ever heard of in show business. After I had recognized, holy cow, the man across from me is Groucho Marx. But as I left, this would be typical. Then he walked to the corner of 5th and 81st with Art Carney and Abe Burrows. They left him. And I went over and said one of my most brilliantly inspired lines, Mr. Marx, I'm a big fan of yours. I thought, oh, God, is that all I could put? And, of course, Groucho said, well, if it gets any hotter, I could use a big fan. And that was the beginning of our relationship. And as is like the voice on what he called the game show, the quiz show, You Bet Your Life, with the same sort of inflection he used there, I heard, well, you seem a nice young man, and I'd like you to have lunch with me. And that was it.
Now, was that after he had started to kind of make a comeback? You know, I've heard of these years when he kind of would wander around just looking for someone to talk to. And
those sad walking his dog in his neighborhood, thinking maybe somebody'd pity him. I mean, yeah, he had a long, dreary period after the quiz show ended. And that was after the movies had ended, although obviously they've never ended. And it was very poignant about him at that stage. Somebody said to me in my amazement once after I'd had him on 4 or 5 times, you know, you've brought Groucho back. You can't imagine what a friend of his, you can imagine what being on your show has done for him. And they said, to congratulate myself a little more, you know, for a long time he hoped your show would call him. He had been a fan for so long.
When you first met him at the funeral, that was when you were a writer on the Jack Parr show.
Yeah.
Would you recount the story of how you ended up on the Parr show? Because I just love that.
Can we make it for the very, very last time?
Yes. Yes. On my show, last time.
I'll spare a lot of the details. But
I love it because that's another case that reminds me, that story reminds me a little bit of myself as a young
what if you'd gotten there first? Of course, you're not the right age.
Well, yeah, that would have been a miracle.
Yeah, real.
I'm nowhere near that old.
Profound miracle. I was an out-of-work actor, having taken a job as a copy boy at Time magazine, which meant going up and down the hall delivering things to people. And somebody had left a Journal American newspaper, gone now, open to a page with a column, and it said Jack worries more about his monologue than anything else in his life, or something like that. So I thought, I'm home, I still have a typewriter. I'll try to write a Jack Parr monologue. So I did, and then I went downtown to the bowels of the RCA building, and I knew where Jack's office was from hanging out as a viewer or sneaker in at The Tonight Show. So I went up the 6th floor, and I thought, I'll push this one step further, and then I'm going to go home. And Jack emerged from down the hall. I had the foresight, people have pointed out, to put my submission in a Time magazine envelope where you could clearly see that it was. I used to sneak into
official business.
Yeah, or get you past a doorman at the Jackie Gleason rehearsals that I would sneak into. I carried a CBS envelope there. And I'd go, hey, how's it going? He'd say, oh, okay. Pop the doorman.
Pre 9/11, it was probably a lot easier to do these things.
I guess so. But here came Jack. I thought, am I hallucinating? This timing is too improbable. Jack, I've written a monologue for you. And he looked at me sort of skeptically, saw the Time envelope and took it, sneaked into the audience to see if, and in the monologue, he pulls out folded papers, and I thought, I know Jack enough without having met him to know that what he's going to say will be along the lines of, hey, I got to tell you, look, see these papers? Some kid came up to me in the hall, and he, as Jack would go, writes better stuff than any of my writers have given me in years, and they're all standing in the way. And then he starts reading, and it's something else. I can remember that in my horrible disappointment and seeing myself going back to copyboying for $60 a week, maybe. I met him in the elevator not by chance afterward. You want to write, don't you, kid? And it came from that.
Yeah, how many years did you write for him then on The Tonight Show?
Well, I think 2 years.
Okay. And then
ask
Carson
the average person, how long was Jack on The Tonight Show? What with
Yeah.
Johnny's 30 years and Dave Letterman? 5 years.
Huh.
And the impact he had in that short time was stunning. By the way, he later said it's the worst mistake I ever made. Leaving when I did, as soon as I did.
Really? Huh.
Yeah.
Well, because you left after he left, right? Or was it before you left and then came back?
When he left, I was out of work, but I managed to transition to the Tonight Show for Johnny.
But before that, you transitioned to the kind of infamous Jerry Lewis late night talk show, didn't you?
I was.
What happened there?
I was a survivor of the Jerry Lewis Saturday night 2-hour show. I saw Jerry a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And I said, did I ever thank you for employing me? And he said, sort of seriously, yeah, it's a shame it didn't last, isn't it? But
why, he could hold people's attention for 24, 48-hour telethon. How come he didn't work in that format as a late night talk show host?
He wasn't comfortable on it, I don't think ever. It only lasted about 12 weeks.
Was it the interviewing he wasn't good at?
Well, my analysis, no, it wasn't that. He got through that on The Tonight Show. What I doped it out as, it's hilarious when Jerry's on someone else's show and he can tear Ed Sullivan's teleprompter paper out of the teleprompter before he gets to it. And on the Tonight Show, he could be disrespectful to the show and its mechanics. And it's, again, he was tearing up someone else's home. It isn't funny if you tear up your own house. Yeah. It's funny if the Marx Brothers stream into somebody's property and mess it up. But when Jerry tried to be the same on that show, it didn't work. And I don't think anybody ever really saw that at the time.
Right. Well, I mean, it's like if Groucho showed up to disrupt his own party. You know?
Yeah.
You have to have the perspective of the outsider.
Or as my great love, Elaine Stritch, in her drunken phases, would palm into somebody's apartment. And that was funnier than if she bombed into her own apartment and started throwing vases and things.
We're going to take a quick break right now, and then I'll be back to talk more with Dick Cavett. Back in just a moment. If you're enjoying my conversation with Dick Cavett, then you'll enjoy his book, Brief Encounters, Conversations, Magic Moments, and Assorted Hijinks. And right now, you can download the audio version of his book for free with a special promotion just for our listeners from Audible.com. Just go to audibletrial.com/kickassnews for a free 30-day trial and a free audiobook download, which can be Brief Encounters by my guest today, Dick Cavett, or any of Audible's 180,000 titles. That's audibletrial.com/kickassnews. Or click on the sponsor link on our webpage to download the free audiobook of your choice. And now, back to the show. You went back to the Tonight Show when Johnny took over.
Yep.
I didn't know this, but apparently you had met him before because you both were magicians from Nebraska, and somewhere along the way when you were a kid, is that true that you met him at a magic conference?
You've done way too much homework.
Have I?
I was in 8th grade, as I recall. 2 little friends, Westminster Church on South Street in Lincoln, Nebraska. The star, Johnny Carson, the star of WOW Radio or KFAB in Omaha, came over, and I knew he was a magician. And my 2 little friends, we went down to the basement where he was going to perform. Nobody there yet, of course. And I said, let's look backstage. And there he was, setting up his props in his act. Huh. He gave us a resentful look. And I said, somehow, wise beyond my years, Johnny, it's okay, we're magicians. His whole manner changed. He welcomed us. He showed us how he did certain card fans and various things. And in the middle of his show, he said, you have some magicians in the audience. And he introduced us, and he remembered our 3 first names.
Huh.
Dick,
wow.
Tom, whoever the other one was. And we felt like we were on the Ed Sullivan Show, of course, because he had introduced people.
Yeah.
And here she is currently starring on Broadway. Some of Ed's lack of skill with the language was hilarious. I finally got on his show once. It
Carson?
Was the last year on the Ed Sullivan.
Oh, Ed Sullivan's show. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Where I had watched probably 100 comedians over the years die or have their career made by being on.
You did stand-up on there?
I was through the looking glass. Yeah, I do believe you can Google it if you have nothing else to watch. Actually, I did well. I wondered, what is it he says to comics when they've finished, they walk over to the right where he disconcertingly stood 6 feet from you, staring in your right ear. And what is the things awkward, undoubtedly, that he says to them? And they're trying to get away because their applause is fading away, and now they're going to have to leave a silent stage against all showbiz instinct.
Yeah.
And as I walked over to him, I thought, I'm finally going to find out. He said, grabbing my hand, "Nice to have you back, youngster."
But that was the first time you had.
Yes. Okay. And I knew what the addled mind of Ed was trying to say was, nice to have you on, perhaps you'll be back. So he got the word back, and he got the word nice to have.
Well, that's nice because
It was nice.
I've heard so many mixed stories about him. Some people say he was the worst bastard ever, and then I've heard stories from people who got blacklisted, and then during
Jackie
McCarthy,
Mason episode,
and he helped them
which
get
we
back
won't need
on.
to go into now.
Oh well, yeah, he wouldn't have nice things to say.
No, but many people did.
Yeah.
He always called you into his office after dress rehearsal, full show dress rehearsal, and then he'd say, "Take out this and this and this." And he did that to Henny Youngman once too many times. And he said it's other comics too. It threw you because you had memorized your order,
Right.
and you'd get to the one place and Ed had cut and you didn't know what came next. And Youngman just pasted him to the wall, not physically, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, you
vocally
don't mess with
some unkind
Youngman's
language.
his shtick, his routine, and his rhythm. Well, eventually you got your own show after writing for all these other guys, and you were on various networks, like we said, for 35 years.
The others about which Johnny, who would have me on every time a Cavett show ended, if this next one doesn't go, it's going to be Armed Forces Radio for Richard. We were such good friends that it was fun.
You and Johnny?
Yeah.
Oh, so there was no friendly competition there?
I was not Joan Rivers when I went off to
Okay, so yeah, how did that?
be off against Johnny Carson.
Yeah, did you call him and give him a heads up? You didn't blindside him like Joan Rivers.
He knew about it. It hadn't occurred to me to think in those terms, but certainly did later. And he was avuncular. How to build a powerful vocabulary. I think I got that from that book as a kid. He was like an uncle to me, and he gave advice, and I'd call him when I felt I needed some for my next show or something.
Really?
Troublesome guest, what do I do? Yeah, so we remained really good friends.
Well, that's cool. You know, a lot of people talk about how he was so, I don't know, cold or isolated, wasn't very social.
Had a ramrod up his spine.
Yeah.
Which I said on a roast of Johnny Carson once, with that pause, of course.
I feel like maybe
he was
treated
cold.
a little unfairly, though.
He was terribly uncomfortable with people.
Really?
One of the most uncomfortable socially.
Yeah.
For all his apparent glibness on his show and charm.
Yeah.
He couldn't make small talk with people.
Yeah, I always wondered if it was just that, you know, from being on for an hour and a half a day, you would know.
Well, that's part of it. It's pretty
I would be
tough
exhausted.
to think.
I would want to go home, hide.
Yeah, when
go
you're
to
thinking
sleep.
soon I'll be in my shower,
Yeah.
and somebody stops you and wants to chat for half an hour about a town in Iowa that they lived in, and he lived near. I rescued him many times from tourists who got through to him. Yeah.
Well, you did have your own show, and perhaps one of the reasons that you were friends is you kind of had your own niches, your own niches.
Yeah, I wasn't doing him. He wasn't
Yeah.
doing me. We both had many of the same guests on, of course. And as somebody said, Cavett's show more oriented to serious guests, a dreadful phrase. And the worst thing that happened to you is you get labeled mistakenly, in my case, as an intellectual. But there was that sort of describes the frequent difference between us, but I had all the same comics he had on at some time or other. Funny people, sports people, politics.
Yeah.
I might have had a wider variety of guests, but
Probably, I would say so. Well, yeah, but you know, both of you had writers on, and it's funny because I never see writers on late night anymore in talk shows, other than maybe J.K. Rowling or some huge, much less a critic or an intellectual on a talk show like you guys
King,
used to have.
because he keeps producing books,
Right.
Wonderful books, yeah. But you're right. I remember some humor writer talking about my starting a talk show said, "Watch. Cavett will put the author on first," because they were always on last.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of those then. There's the infamous episode with Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer.
Do I have to talk about that?
Okay, we don't have to. We can skip through it. And Norman Mailer
Unfortunately,
was
in
drunk,
a way,
right?
one of the most contentious moment between me and Norman Mailer, to the delight of Gore Vidal, is right there on YouTube. But I'm sorry for people who can't see the whole show. I got to put it out some way on a disc or something, because the tension that starts about a third of the way in and builds after Norman, half pissed if not more, comes on with his pugilist walk, which is always a bad sign, fists halfway up in there. To gut Gore Vidal. And, of course, he got gutted because it was Gore Vidal.
And what was it? Was Gore Vidal had written a bad review of his book? Was that what spurred that?
Not quite. He had written a long piece in the New York Review of Books with a piece called, and he referred to it as 3M. Miller, Henry Miller, of course, Norman Mailer, Charles Manson. Different degrees of destruction of women.
Yeah.
Trump later picked that up, of course.
Yeah.
But and Norman was there to kill Gore for what he wrote, and it's frightening to watch. And then he said, "Oh, I wouldn't fight with any people here because they're all smaller than I am." And I said, "In what ways smaller?" And that's where the intellect came up. He had announced that he was more intelligent than the other people.
That's right. His intelligence.
And I think I said, maybe you'd like another chair to contain your giant intellect. And, of course, that got an anti-Norman laugh that lasted for a while. And there were a couple more lines like that.
Yeah.
And then he went too far. I didn't know what could ignite me quite as much as confusing me with David Frost. By saying, why don't you just look down and read the next question off the question sheet?
Oh, yeah.
And I said, why don't you fold it 5 ways and put it where the moon don't shine? Now, that line nearly stopped the show. Then he opened him, he let down his guard for a moment and said, Cavett, is that something you just had canned for years, just waiting for the moment to use it? I said, do I have to tell you a quote from Tolstoy? Well... That brought the audience to my side again. But that was, Norman loved that. He loved his image of himself as a scrapping, brawling.
Like Hemingway.
Only problem being I have a modest Jewish dick, he said once somewhere, while a little inebriated. But he was a great writer, and nobody disputes that.
Oh, yeah. Were many of them inebriated when they came on the show?
Not as many as in England.
Okay.
England has the... perhaps civilized habit of having a entire drinks collie. What do you call it? Drinks trolley. A drinks collie is on Stupid Pet Tricks. A drinks trolley, as the Brits call it, with every booze imaginable, and they get pissed.
Yeah.
I had a Lord George Brown, hyphenate on, and he was stewed to other people's gills. He was so drunk. But he was a member of the House of Lords. And at one point in his career, he said, well, of course I botched that whole damn thing in Parliament because I was drunk at the time. So, yeah, in England, and actually a drink before going on a talk show is not a bad idea. Don't make it too strong. A teaspoon of wine even, for me, will take that little edge off.
Well, I had 3 martinis at lunch before I came in here, so...
Well, I can tell you don't have your pants. You should have your pants on, really.
Well, what was the one? Speaking of that, with I think it was John Cassavetes, Peter Falk, where you just lost control of the whole show. You just gave up at that point.
You have a way of bringing them up.
It's hard.
We can shortcut this because YouTube, I notice now, lists Cavett's worst show ever. And that
I'd say it's a toss-up between that and The Death, but okay.
That's another story I'm bloody sick of. But,
yeah, I'm sure.
Yes, people can find this story on various places. Yeah, whom would you decide that the gods would finger to die on a talk show in front of the audience, but a health expert?
Yeah.
J.I. Rodale, yeah.
Yeah, you were the only one who had a guest die on the show.
And
I distinctly remember watching that and just being stunned.
How did you see it?
I'm just teasing
you. Oh,
because
you know
and I know. I wanted to see how you'd say
you read my column about that.
Yeah, because it never aired, but you get that a lot apparently, don't you?
People who could pass a polygraph say things like, well, I'll never forget that, the look on your face when that guy died. Some say croaked, if they're rude. And I have to say, well, you were in the studio then? No, why? Well, I'm afraid it never aired.
I wouldn't think it would have.
And they're still not convinced. even after you say that.
Really? They have these false memories of having watched that episode.
Well, maybe I can take credit for
died.
making it vivid the next night, talking about it, but I don't think that would do that. But the world is full of this. First of all, it shows one thing that's a truth that policemen know, or prosecutors. Eyewitness testimony isn't worth you know what. and that's happened over and over. You know, it was a red car, and the next person said, no, it wasn't a red car, it was a black car. And he was black. No, he was white. Or no, he was an Asian. And the thing that gets dumped on, circumstantial evidence, is the most valuable evidence there is.
Right.
Because there's no other kind of evidence unless they witnessed the crime.
Yeah. Well, you know, you had the O.J. trial was thousands of pieces of circumstantial evidence, and that apparently that wasn't enough. So.
It was not enough for various reasons that have all been explored.
Yeah.
But only a dog saw that wonderful, handsome football player slash the throat of his wife, and Mr. Oh God, I blanked on his name. Yeah, that was a botched miscarriage of justice, but a beautiful tribute to the skilled attorney who, as we're always reminded, his job is to give his client the best defense he can because it's what he's entitled to. I'm sorry that the bastard went free even for a time. And I always thought that I would meet him at a party and talk cordially to him and ask him a couple things and then say, I'm sorry, I have to move on. I have to go over there and talk to someone who hasn't murdered anybody. And I honestly would have done it. I know I would have done it. And I'm so sorry I never got the chance. Maybe I still will.
He's supposed to get out of jail pretty soon, I think. He's up for parole, so.
Oh, yeah, well.
hang around.
If I can do anything to influence the parole board, OJ, let me know.
Let me ask you about Nixon.
When I was yet persona grata at the White House and attended an evening of Shakespeare that Nixon had booked with the actor Nicol Williamson. So I met him in the reception line, all the tuxedos, hauled him in Nixon's lickspittle, to employ a Elizabethan term that's gone out of use. Greeted me the cheeriest he could. But then the series of things began. I testified for John Lennon not being thrown out of the country by the great unindicted co-conspirator from Yorba Belinda. And other incidents, people I had on the show. The White House kept count of the anti-Nixon talk that occurred on my show from inevitably time to time. They had a list. They even put a guy on once to refute the fact that it killed them when Arthur Godfrey came out against the SST. So they put a dreary man on named Magruder. He came on and I let him defend and refute in his humorless way what I had said. And now I had paid my bill to the Nixons on that subject. Except that at the end I said, well, you've told this well. I certainly hope the SST is defeated, but thank you for being on. So that flared it up. And then one day I had the fun of a guy opening a laptop near me some years later and playing an excerpt from the Nixon tapes. Yeah. Photos on the screen. This is on air, online too. And whenever I just need a refreshment, I can go back to the last line to Haldeman. There must be something to do to Cavett to screw him. And screw was a clean word in his filthy mouth. Yeah. And what did Haldeman say? Yeah. We were trying. We've been trying. And Haldeman says, we're working on it. Or we'll show you. We've objected to the Cavett show many times. May have not have been true. Did you know that you were on his enemies list prior to years later listening to the Nixon tapes? About that. I mean, I assumed I was not on his anti-enemies list, but Paul Newman found that being on his enemies list officially was the best thing he was proud of next to his 3 Oscars. All right, last one, Brando, because you two were friends too. We became friends from that night. Somewhere I heard a story about you and Brando were having dinner and a woman came up. Well, is that true, or is that? You don't have to check the archives for that. Not the fun of seeing him break a man's jaw 8 inches from my face.
Okay, there's that one too.
Which was later, but and that story can be found in various places.
Yeah,
but
some woman came up and offered, and you almost ended up in a threesome with a woman and Brando.
I don't know how close we came, but
I'm hoping this was when he was still skinny.
No, this was when, with his hand still bleeding from breaking Ron Palilla's jaw, we went to the Russian tea room, and a young lady smitten with joy, it seemed, came over to our table. Actually, she was rather speaking low and polite. And she said, "I just can't believe that I'm seeing the two of you. I'm sorry to interrupt your conversation." To which Groucho once said to a woman, "Then you can't control yourself." Right? And he meant it. But I would do anything either you want or both of you want, anything in the world. She was in the Coco Chanel combination of shirt and skirt, that blue and white. Probably a young college girl. And anything you want, I mean, you name it, I'll do it. And
that's quite an offer.
I'm kind of embarrassed to be saying this, but the worst part of it is I have to warn you that I have rather small breasts. And Marlon said, "Don't worry about that, honey. I've gone to bed with women who have 2 tits, 1 tit, cross-eyed tits, sagging tits, big tits, little, and it doesn't matter. You don't worry about it." Gave us her phone number.
Yeah.
Walked away. As I said goodnight to Marlon next night, and he said, "Let's have breakfast." So I said, "Okay, I know you're tired. Go." And as he was walking away, I said, 724-3968. He said, "You bastard." I pretended that was the phone number she had given us. And that I obviously was going, well, yeah.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Dick Cavett. I'm a huge fan. I appreciate it. I want to plug your book, don't we?
Did we mention?
Let's mention that.
It's
you can get it
talked
on Amazon.
Earlier. It's another collection of my Times blogs on just about everybody.
And you said you're working on a documentary about you and
documentary
Muhammad
film
Ali,
about
right?
my lifetime, it seems, with Ali and what good buddies we were. I'm not bragging, of course. Was it Kent Norton who busted his jaw? I think so. Yeah. And he came on forlorn. Some of it was acting, but sure. "Dick, I'm just old, broke down fighter, broken jaw, probably done with. And nobody called me except the Dick Cavett show. You my main man, Dick." Black folks, as we were allowed to call them then, instead of the other euphemism, African American, PC at its best, would say to me for a long time after, "Do you know what it meant to be called Ali's main man?" And I didn't really know the significance of that phrase, but
well, I look forward to this documentary. It's the timing is poignant because I think he just died a few days ago.
It won't be that
right
soon, and I
this,
did go to his funeral.
Yeah, sad ending.
Yep.
There.
Well, thank you for making this painless.
Well, thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Okay. Dick Cavett, thanks for coming on the show.
This will be heard somewhere, will it?
Well, it'll be out there. I can't promise it'll be heard.
You're not. That's good. Can I use that?
Yeah, you can. Thank you, Dick Cavett. Thanks again to Dick Cavett for coming on the show. And if you enjoyed this 100th episode, which I know you did, you'll love his book, Brief Encounters, Conversations, Magic Moments, and Assorted Hijinks. I'll include an Amazon link where you can order it in the show notes for this episode or on our website at kickassnewspodcast.com. Or if you'd prefer to listen to the audio version, you can download that for free through that special trial offer just for our listeners at audibletrial.com/kickassnews. You can follow Dick Cavett on Twitter at @TheDickCavett and visit his website at dickcavettshow.com. He has all kinds of fun stuff on there, including a full episode guide and guest lists. He has news, clips from the Dick Cavett Show, and his favorite moments. It's just great, so go check it out. Be sure to subscribe to Kick-Ass News on iTunes and leave us a review while you're there. You can visit Kick-Ass News on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at @KAPolitics. And please be sure to recommend Kick-Ass News to your friends on your social media. And if you really want to help out, then donate to our GoFundMe campaign at gofundme.com/kickassnews, or make a recurring donation at patreon.com/kickassnews. And as always, I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnewspodcast.com. For now, though, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to the 100th episode of Kick-Ass News. Kick-Ass News is a trademark of Mathis Entertainment, Inc.